Thank you. Welcome to the Community Development, General Government Housing Committee meeting for Tuesday, April 13, 2021. Due to the Safer at Home order, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized, raise their hand, and state their vote. Committee members are Councilmember Annette Scipio, Vice Chair, Councilmember Robert Clark, and Councilmember Kevin Monday, and myself, Mayor Pro Tem Denise Adams. Today we have 4 consent items and 6 general items on our agenda. The first thing that we'll do is ask any of the committee and council, are there any that they want to be pulled? I have pulled C3. And if they're not, Councilmember Monday?
Yes, we don't need to pull C1, but I do have a question about that after we vote.
After the vote?
Yes, that's fine after the vote.
Okay, any other?
I move approval of the balance.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded for the approval of the balance of the consent agenda. Is the clerk going to call the roll, or I'm calling? Okay, because I noticed Councilmember Clark had you doing it.
Or whatever you want.
I'm gonna let you do it.
Okay. Councilmember Scipio,
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy,
Yes.
Councilmember Clark,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes, and the motion passes. City Clerk, would you please read item C3?
Item C3, resolution ratifying continuation of a temporary COVID-19 shelter for persons who are experiencing homelessness and medically fragile, and funding not to exceed $95,199 per month to support the operation thereof.
Ms. Logan Ford and Ms. Newman, I think this was on yesterday's agenda. Am I correct? Yes, was it on in finance? Yes, but it wasn't pulled for people to hear what this is about in light of us, being in the paper recently for some things. I think it would be great if you could go ahead and review this.
Sure, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. Item G3 is relative to the medically fragile shelter that the city has been operating, and also an extension for the hoteling operations through cities with dwellings. The medically fragile shelter that the city has been operating since April of last year. And I would ask Ms. Newman, our Community Development Director, if she would share the details for both the medically fragile shelter and also the operation extension associated with cities with dwellings.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. As stated, I'm Marla Newman, Community Development Director. Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee, other council members, good afternoon. As Ms. Logan Ford stated, the medically fragile shelter opened in April of 2020 in response to the COVID pandemic. The shelter is to house individuals who were in need of social distancing and to be removed from a congregate setting because of chronic health conditions that put them at higher risk of a poor outcome were they to contract COVID. That shelter had been operating initially as a collaborative between the United Way, the Bethesda Center for the Homeless, and cities with dwellings. As time progressed in September, operations were vested completely within the Bethesda Center for the Homeless. Some of the services that have been provided at the medically fragile shelter include 3 meals a day provided by Samaritan Ministries, regular medical checkups for overall well-being, scheduled mental health and substance abuse reviews and care, case management with the idea of helping individuals transition from the shelter into permanent housing, and then additional supportive services as needed to secure continuity of care. We have also had the facility staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That also included security that was provided by the Winston-Salem Police Department. Of the 109 guests who have been at the shelter, 65 have moved into permanent housing. Others have exited to a variety of locations. And as of today, The shelter houses 19 individuals, including an infant that was born there in January. So we started out with 3 floors of the hotel, 20 rooms per floor. And we have now, with this latest change in structure, been able to reduce the usage of the hotel to 1 floor to house those 19 guests. Based on the census or the number of people remaining, Bethesda Center for the Homeless believes that the majority of these individuals will be able to find permanent housing by the end of May. There is a slight possibility that not everyone will be placed, but Bethesda did mention that there is space within their shelter for support should not everyone have found a permanent home by the end of May. In addition, as Ms. Logan Ford mentioned, City with Dwellings, who was a partner in the medically fragile shelter at the beginning, usually every winter, they do a program that provides shelter for individuals who have been living on the streets, who need a place to be warm in the winter. This particular winter, rather than the usual partnerships that City with Dwellings has to house individuals who are otherwise living on the street, they also, with the use of city money through ESG, used a hoteling situation to cover these individuals. The winter shelter usually ends the end of March, but we had a few individuals remaining in that winter shelter who were targeted to have permanent housing by the end of this week. And so City with Dwellings asked if we could enable them to continue the winter shelter for 2 additional weeks, which gets us through tomorrow, so that those individuals could transition from that winter shelter to permanent housing. And so the budget that you have here shows the extension of the 2 weeks for City with Dwellings winter shelter. It shows, and this is a monthly cost, the medically fragile shelter staffing for Bethesda Center for the Homeless, and then the cost of the hotel, 20 rooms per month, and at $34,332, $32,500 for the security, and then the additional services we also provide for the guests at the hotel for the medically fragile shelter includes an extra layer of cleaning by an outside third party, as well as laundry. So this first month is basically $95,199. Of course, there will be a reduction in this amount for May because we will be subtracting the $12,367 that represents the 2 weeks extension for City with Dwellings.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the committee or council members? Vice Chair Scipio.
Yes, Ms. Newman, I may not have heard this, but this is coming from the federal funds we got, correct, for homeless?
No, ma'am. This is money that we will be reimbursed by the state instead of by FEMA directly, where a lot of our CARES Act or COVID expenses were initially being reimbursed by FEMA. We have a contract with the state Department of Health and Human Services so that the state would reimburse the city 100% of eligible costs, and then the state would go and seek reimbursement from FEMA. So these funds would come under that contract, with the exception of the City with Dwellings amount, which is separate and under federal funds.
Okay. Is there, are there situations in which people who are homeless do not qualify or can get these funds? Are people who are homeless rejected from this program for any circumstances?
So these individuals are considered chronically homeless and at high risk of COVID. So they are first and foremost homeless. Secondly, they had been previously in what we call a congregate setting or a shelter setting. Because of their high risk, they need to be in separate facilities. So first and foremost, you have to be homeless to be a part of this. And second, you have to be high risk because of health conditions for COVID. One other good thing to mention, however, is at the time we drafted this item, almost half of the population in the medically fragile shelter at that time had received at least their first COVID vaccination. So, of course, the number is higher now with the reduction in the census, but we don't have the information yet on whether they have received their second shot and if any others have decided to take the shot. So that has also minimized some of the risk for these individuals, the fact that they have been able to get their first COVID vaccination.
That's outstanding. So I guess what I'm asking is, can anyone who is homeless and who is homeless get this service? Do they have to go through an established provider such as the Bethesda Center or another shelter in order to get benefits for the homeless?
For the shelter, you do have to go through the Bethesda Center for the Homeless because one of the requirements is you have to be assigned a case manager. And that case manager looks at your overall picture, assesses what wraparound services that you may be in need of, as well as help you put together a housing stability plan. And so the way that that is set up is actually through the shelters because that's who employs the case managers. So someone has to come through the shelter and then they can be referred. Now, there could be other individuals who may not have initially connected with Bethesda Center for the Homeless. There is a number that you can contact through the coordinated intake center and then still be connected and enrolled through the shelter in order to have the case manager. But you must have a case manager and be referred from a shelter in order to access the medically fragile shelter because they have to make an assessment of your condition.
And just one more question. Because we offer this service, it's still something that people have to say they really want. They can reject it if they don't like whatever's being offered, correct?
That's correct. That is correct.
It's not something that they have to take it, but people still have the ability to say, I don't want to do that, even though it's been offered to them.
That is correct.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson.
Yes, thank you. Am I to assume then that this solves basically the housing issue for this population through May? But no, does it go beyond May?
This request is to terminate at the end of May, which is when the Bethesda Center for the Homeless represented to us that they thought there was no longer going to be a need for the shelter. And should there have been a gap, that they could manage the gap themselves, but that there would no longer be a need to stand up this particular shelter.
Okay, are any of these tenants involved from our tent villages that we have throughout the town? Are any of the residents involved in that population or not?
No, sir. The only people involved at this particular location were referred from the shelter as having sought services through one of our local shelters and agreed to participate in the programs that the shelters offered, including case managers.
Thank you. Exactly. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Councilmember Burke.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee. Ms. Newman, were campers at the encampments offered this service?
I cannot speak to that. I believe that when this program started, it was those who were in direct relationship with the shelters. And so it was those who made themselves known to want housing stability services who were then identified and prioritized to come into the shelter based on their chronic health conditions. So whether those who might be camping actually made themselves known to the shelters and asked for assistance, I cannot speak to.
Let me ask you this. Do you know if any of the campers have case managers?
No, ma'am, I don't know.
Okay. And do we know whether or not the COC and members of the Bethesda Center or City with Dwellings have been to the encampments to at least speak with the campers at the encampments?
So there is a designated street outreach team. And I know there are individuals who also work in collaboration with cities with dwellings, and it is their responsibilities to go to those who are considered part of those in the street or who are camping. And so those are the services that they offer directly. That is not necessarily a day-to-day function of a place like Bethesda Center because it's running a day shelter and a night shelter. And so that's why there are designated street outreach teams whose specialty is to go out and identify locations and offer services to those on the street. So again, I can't speak to anything above that, perhaps as it relates to like the Bethesda Center or even Samaritan Ministries or the Salvation Army. But I do know that through the COC, there's a street outreach team as well as a team that works in collaboration with City with Dwellings, and that is their specialty.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Newman. I'm just wondering how these campers are connected with case managers and with these resources. I'm just really curious about that, but thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Clark, did I see your hand?
No, I'm happy.
Oh, so you was just brushing your hair. Okay. Ms. Newman,
Yes, ma'am.
can you follow up to Councilmember Burke's question or concern as to how would we know whether the encampments in town are being communicated to of any services that we taxpayer dollars provide in collaboration with these other shelters, because we may have to help, find out whether it's going on, and we may have to do some marketing or something on our own. Another thing is we're now hearing about the surge of the other variant and the virus as well. Being that we have all learned lessons this past year, would you say we are in a better position if there is a surge to address our homeless population with shelters and that sort of thing? Again.
So I do think that we are in a better position, notwithstanding, the efficacy of the vaccines relative to the variants, but we have been fortunate that in our shelters, we've not had reports of COVID cases. So the steps that our shelters took day one with social distancing, our ability to stand up the medically fragile shelter, has, I think, proven to be a step in the right direction and probably a great case study on how you go into action quickly and avoid a situation that I know has occurred in numerous cities across the country. So I'm proud of our shelter providers for the steps that they took and the collaboration that we had to create the medically fragile shelter. So I do think that we are in a better place. I do know that a lot of the shelters have been diligent about offering the vaccine, offering to provide transportation to vaccine sites, making its availability known. And I believe that a number of persons who are experiencing homelessness have indeed accepted the offer to get the vaccine. So I think that we've been very fortunate as a community. And I think the way we approached this in the very beginning has proven to be very smart on our community's part.
Thank you. May I have a motion to approve this item, please?
Move approval. Clark.
Second, Scipio.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Councilmember Clark and Vice Chair Scipio. Item C3, City Clerk, may we have the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes,
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
and the motion passes. City Clerk, could we now go to the general agenda, please?
Mayor Pro Tem, before we do that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Mundy. You
Thank
wanted to
you.
make a comment? on
That's fine.
C1.
We'll see one, this is procedural question. Will this move on to the consent agenda for the next full council meeting?
Yes.
Okay, I just want, when that time comes, for staff to share a brief presentation on those names and a synopsis of why they're being recognized. I just don't want that to be overlooked, so that they've got a public recognition at that point in time.
I would.
Monday.
Then I need to pull it to put it on the general agenda, so it's called out in that fashion. The city attorney just informed me. So are any actions required of me? Is there an action to pull it?
No, what I was saying was that on Monday night, he'll need to pull it from consent.
Oh,
so it can be discussed with the general agenda items.
Okay.
yeah.
And yeah, no need to do it now and then.
Yeah.
And so I will just do
Well,
it.
you can do it Monday. He can do it Monday.
Yeah, and Councilmember Mundy, we do normally do this when we recognize our employees and citizens in any fashion. Just like when they get on a commission or a board, we want the community to know who these folks are that stepped up or who are being recognized. So thank you
Absolutely.
for bringing that point to us. Okay?
Thank you.
City Clerk.
Item G1, ordinance amending various sections of the Unified Development Ordinances to align with the General Assembly's combination of chapters 153A and 160A into chapter 160D for local planning and development regulation, UDO CC 10.
Mr. King, I know you're going to be presenting this. Fellow committee members and council, I hope you read this one. And if not, Mr. King is going to go through it, but you need to go read this one. This is not something we created. This is something the state created, and they've been working on it a while. Mr. King.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. So I'm actually going to have Chris Murphy, our deputy director, present this, but I want to tee this up for him to kind of dovetail with the comments you made. This text amendment that Chris is going to be briefing you on is a result of legislation passed at the state level that basically took chapter 153A and chapter 160A, which were our respective city and county chapters, planning statute chapters in the state statutes, merged them into a new chapter 160D. And really the impetus behind that was to really be very similar to what we did with our UDO, make the document more user-friendly, standardized terminology, and really have a common set of rules, whether you're in the city or the county. So it was not really intended to make development harder or easier on individuals. It was really kind of a cleanup at the state level. And what the state has basically said is, if you have a UDO, you've got to bring it into compliance with Chapter 160D by June 30th. So our staff has been working very closely with staff from the city attorney's office and the county attorney's office, because the county has to do the same thing as well. We began our review. I think we were doing this once a week beginning back in the fall. And so we vetted all, I think, 122 pages very carefully. And the final product is what is before you today. Chris Murphy is going to give a very efficient but thorough presentation of this item. So Meredith, if you want to pull up the slideshow, I think Chris is ready to get going on this.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, members of City Council. I think Aaron did a pretty good job of teeing that up, so I'm not really even going to probably go over these first couple of slides. Meredith, if you want to go ahead and at least go to the next one and let's see what's there. Yeah, as Aaron alluded to, this was 122 pages of text that made up 160D through the general statutes. And just to kind of show you how, luckily our UDO was fairly consistent with the general statutes. That 122-page document translated into a 240-page book that the School of Government put out. And we only had to have 26 pages of text amendments, 29 sections. So I feel like, we've done a pretty good job of keeping our UDO up to date. But, this is the first comprehensive recodification and modernization since 1905. This has been a multi-year effort, which began in 2013. As Aaron did allude to, this is essentially a cleanup, and it basically put all the planning statutes in one place, 160D. And basically, I'm going to present the text amendment not in the order that they appear in 160D itself. but in the order they appear in our ordinance. So Meredith, if you could go to the next slide. And this is a chart that breaks down the section that's in your staff report and the section that's in the actual ordinance in your book, the UDO sections that it changes, kind of what the synopsis and the purpose of that is and what the impact is. And I'm happy to report that the impact column really is either none or minimal. Again, these are things that really aren't meant to be substantive. There are a couple things that kind of rise a little bit above no impact, but for the most part, it's really just putting our ordinance in line with 160D. Section 1 and 2, both of those sections are really clerical in nature. Instead of calling out each individual place where we had an existing 153A or a 160A reference and changing the 160D, changing that reference to the corresponding 160D, we're just basically saying we're going to do this. And it's really just a clerical thing. Same thing with Section 2. The state said if you're going to have design review guidelines, you can't call them guidelines. You have to call them standards. And all those are related to our historic preservation things. So we'll go through and change those references as well. Section 3 is the first substantive change, as far as being specific. And this really just changes the vesting provisions in the ordinance. And for those who aren't aware of what vesting is, essentially ensuring that if we make a development approval, that the folks that are expending money on that have the right to continue with that. Even if we change the ordinance, even if the rules change, they're allowed to continue and proceed with their development. And essentially, Section 3 under 160D just provides them with some additional options that currently aren't in our UDO, provides some additional time frames for larger scale projects such as Brookberry and things like that that are going to be transpiring over a course of 10, 15, 20 years. It just provides some additional guidance on those. Section 4 codifies and clarifies that we can accept a rezoning request and development application for consideration, even as it's going through the process of being annexed, so long as the decision on the project isn't made until it has been annexed. It can be done at the same meeting. Again, we don't run into that a lot, but there are some instances where someone wants to annex into the city and submit a development application, and there's never been a lot of clarity there as to can they submit while they're going through the annexation process. Section 5 amends the exempt subdivision provisions to match the language in the North Carolina General Statutes. This essentially just simplifies and better explains some of those additional exempt subdivision provisions. Section 6, this is something that will affect the city. It's actually been in the statutes, I believe, about the last 4 or 5 years. It was never changed in our book. I believe it has been changed in practice with engineering, but essentially it caps the surety bond for incomplete infrastructure at 25% above anticipated cost instead of what we did have on our ordinance at 50%. So the impact there is we'll just need to make sure that we have good cost estimates when folks are submitting their cost estimates for their incomplete infrastructure to make sure that the city's protected in case they default. Section 7 provides just another category of minor subdivision based on size and length of time since the last subdivision approval on that piece of property. Again, really no impact. Section 8, this removes the verified motion process for elected body special use permits. If you remember, whenever the elected body, whenever you consider an elected body special use permit, there is a provision in the ordinance that allows for a verified motion where folks can submit their comments to you through this process. And the statute doesn't allow that for special use permits. The only information that can be conveyed to the board is the name and address of the person submitting comments. So we had to take the verified motion provisions out as part of this cleanup. It doesn't impact the case itself. It's just you won't know what your constituents are feeling until they show up at the meeting. Section 9 clarifies the publication requirement for notices of public hearing for UDO text amendments. We've, in talking to the city clerk's office, they have been doing this. It's just, it wasn't codified in our ordinance that it required 2 notices to run. So we changed our ordinance to reflect our practice. But like I said, we'd already been doing that. Section 10 provides that written statements may be submitted for UDO text amendments, and that those comments will be forwarded to the elected body as long as they are received 2 days prior to the hearing. And, there's really no impact there. I believe we already do that. But again, it's just providing that clarification on how those comments can be submitted and make sure they are forwarded to the elected body. With that, Meredith, you would proceed to the next slide. Section 11 is similar to, I believe, the one we talked about in Section 9. It's just that published notice, and that's for a zoning map amendment. Again, has to be published 2 consecutive weeks in the paper, and that's what we've been doing, but the ordinance is just being cleaned up to reflect that. Under Section 12, this section updates and provides better guidance on potential conflicts of interest for the elected body when considering development approvals. I believe, again, this is something that, through the ethics officer, I believe our elected body, and there's a later one for the planning board, have already been adhering to these. But again, it just provides guidance in the ordinance on what constitutes a potential conflict of interest. Under Section 13, this section provides, similar to, I believe, Section 10, that written statements may be submitted for zoning map amendments, and as long as those comments are received 2 days prior to the hearing, they'll be forwarded to the council either at their meeting or before the meeting. Section 14 provides for what can and cannot be approved through the staff change process. This is not a change in practice. It's a requirement of the statute that if you have a provision that allows staff to make administrative changes to approve plans, that it has to be in the ordinance. We've had the staff change authority that was granted by City Council and the County Commissioner since 1979, and that's the document that we use. It kind of spells out what can and can't be approved through the staff change process. All we have done is incorporate the information in the respective city and county resolutions into the ordinance so that it's clear under what authority and under what situations we can approve staff changes. Section 15. This adds amateur radio antennas up to a maximum height of 90 feet as something that can exceed the maximum height specified in any given zoning district. This seems to be a change, but it's not a change from our practice. The FCC policies have required this at least since the mid-2000s. And we never got around to codifying it. We get so few of these. I would say probably in the last 15 years, we've probably had 2 or 3 requests for a ham radio tower. And a lot of times they're right around the height threshold. But again, this just basically says that if they're not any taller than 90 feet, they're good to go. Section 16 provides guidance to both applicants and local governments regarding how properties with split jurisdiction can be treated. This isn't a requirement, but local governments may, by mutual agreement and with permission of the landowner, assign exclusive planning and development jurisdiction and rights to one entity. In other words, if there's a piece of property that has split city and county jurisdiction, if the city and the county and the landowner wanted to enter into an agreement and basically say, I want this development proposal to only go to the city, then they could do that. But again, it would require all 3 parties to agree to that. Under Section 17, this clarifies what can be regulated as it pertains to single family and duplex developments regarding the building design elements. This is really only important for NCOs. There is a provision in the new statute that says if you're going to rezone a piece of property and you're going to try to regulate building design elements such as exterior cladding type, color, style of materials of exterior roofing and porches, the location of doors and windows, et cetera, you have to have 100% agreement by all folks that will be impacted by that rezoning. And again, this really only comes into play for NCOs. If someone wants to propose an NCO and they want to have some of these elements, everyone in their neighborhood would have to agree to that element for it to be able to be adopted as part of the NCO standards. If it's not one of those elements, there are other thresholds in the ordinance that spell, I think it's like 75% agreement. But if they want to have any of these elements, it's got to be 100% agreement. So we just basically referred to this section of the statutes in our NCO provisions so that folks are aware that if they're going to ask for any of these kind of things, you got to have 100% buy-in.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Can I ask you to explain to the public what NCO is?
I'm sorry, Neighborhood Conservation Overlay District. And we have, I believe, 3 of those. There's one in Country Club Estates, there's one in Mallard Lakes, and there's one over off of
Stratford Crest.
The Stratford Crest neighborhood over back behind the old putt-putt, that area over there. Meredith, if you could go to the next slide. We only have this, and there's 2 more on the next page. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this quick. I appreciate you indulging me. When we did this presentation to the planning board, it was actually 55 minutes. So if you want to see an in-depth, you can take a look at that, but I'm going to try to be done in 10 minutes. Section 18, this provides for and authorizes small-scale wireless facilities to be co-located within the right-of-way. We already do this, but we wanted to make sure that our use conditions reference the appropriate sections of the general statutes. Again, it puts some limitations on that. The poles within the right-of-way can't be any taller than 40 feet in residential and 50 feet in non-residential zoning districts. And that's similar to the height of existing utility poles in those zoning districts. Section 19 is a county-only provision. It's the companion to Section 18. There are separate transmission tower use conditions for the city and the county. They weren't adopted exactly the same. So Section 19 is the county version of 18. Section 20 provides, and this has actually been in the statute for several years, but we had never gone back in and codified it. But since we are cleaning all this up, we want to do this. Temporary healthcare structures are permitted and they must be allowed as long as those healthcare structures are consistent with 160D 915, and that has some provisions that deal with the size and the location of them. But essentially, they are meant to be able, it's essentially, it says you have to allow them, and it's in situations where you have a loved one who needs some care, and instead of putting them in a long-term care facility, you want to either bring them on your property and put them in one of these facilities, or you want to put one of those facilities on their property and you live in it to help care for them and their daily needs. Once that need goes away, i.e. they are healthy or they've passed on, then those structures have to be removed within a specified period of time. Section 21, this just provides an additional type of exempt signage. We already do this, but it allows for what are called fence wraps on construction sites, on construction fences, to have like the logo and the name of the project and the name of the contractor doing the work on those. We've always allowed that, but again, this just makes it clear by putting it in the ordinance. Section 22 is a county-only provision for the same thing. Again, the county and the city sign regulations are different. Section 23, this just provides an additional remedy for illegally transferring a lot in an approved subdivision, and the new remedy that is specified is that you can withhold the issuance of building permits for those illegally subdivided lots. I was under the assumption we could always do that, and we probably could, but it's clear in the ordinance now that if this is adopted, that we do have that as another tool. Section 24 amends the exempt subdivision provisions to match the language in the statutes to ensure consistent language for what constitutes an exempt subdivision. It basically provides some simple and better explanation on what those exempt subdivisions are. Again, no impact. It's just really clarifying language. Section 25 is the companion to the earlier one, which updates the conflict of interest provisions for the planning board. The earlier one was for the elected body. This is for the planning board. Again, not anything new here. Our attorney's office always provides that guidance, and I don't believe we've had any issues with that. Section 26 provides, it just clarifies what items can be appealed to the Board of Adjustment, and further it provides that any item appealed to the Board of Adjustment is subject to the requisite fees and submittal requirements. This is a statutory thing. It's been in there. Again, it's just providing some clarifying language. We did need to provide a little additional local clarity in that whenever we have had some housing appeals, it basically in the city code, it just says it's appealed to the Board of Adjustment, but it didn't make it clear that they had to pay a fee and submit through our process to be heard as an appeal. So again, this is just a little bit of cleaning up our practices in addition to making sure we match the statute. Section 27 provides another remedy for violations of a special use district rezoning and special use district permit, and that is that we can actually revoke that permit so long as the process for revocation matches the process for issuance, i.e. it would be subject to a public hearing. So if someone is going out and they got a special use rezoning to do something and, rezone the property for some type of commercial use, and they're doing something they're not supposed to on the site, in addition to all our normal remedies as far as taking them to court and fining them on all those kind of things, if they just won't comply, we could always just revoke the permit and then, let the court handle it from there. Section 27 is what I just went over, sorry. If you would just go to the next one, Section 28 is a county-only provision, and that doesn't follow 27. This is actually, there is a provision in, let me get to it. Section 28 was dealing with bona fide farms, and bona fide farm is a county-only provision. So that's not anything we need to worry about here. Just basically change the definition to match the state definition for what a bona fide farm entails. And then the final item, Section 29, is basically just amending our definition to match what's in the statutes for major and minor subdivisions, and making sure that our definition matches exactly what the state definition is. And it's close, but there are a couple tweaks that were made. Look, I know that's a lot of information. The slides that are off the back end of this, we don't need to get to. Those were where I had done this in a different format, but actually, the table format puts it in a manner that I think is easier to digest. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, for suggesting that. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions. Again, I know this is an awful lot of information, but I hope you'll understand that what we did, matches what was required of us, and it was fully vetted by both the city and the county attorney's office. And I want to thank them both for their help on this. This was a lot of work for all involved.
And Mr. Murphy and Mr. King and the both attorney's office and all the staff that was involved to get this done. Again, they've been working on it since 2013. What I would have, and I'm gonna call him Councilmember Larson, what I would ask committee and council to do is the last few slides of the presentation, again, reinforces what Mr. Murphy communicated to us, but it breaks it down even more. Councilmember Larson. And then not Larson, McIntosh. vote. Okay, Councilmember Larson first. I got people putting up signs. And then Councilmember McIntosh.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Am I to assume that this is already the law of the state and that what we're doing is bringing it in conformance? And second question is this going to be voted on then on our next meeting, and it doesn't require a public hearing at all at this point?
It will be the law of the land come July 1. The effective date is July 1 of this year. We're supposed to have it adopted. And yes, it won't come to your meeting on Monday night. It will come to the meeting, the first meeting, the regular zoning meeting in May, but it will have to be voted on.
And it will require a public hearing.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Yeah, I just want to shout out to Chris Murphy and staff that I have a whole new level of respect for the ability to absorb and process mind-numbing material. I know this is stuff that you guys live and breathe every day, but still, even just the way what you condensed for us is it's a lot to get through. But my appreciation, and it's also really nice to see that we don't have to make that many changes. We have been keeping up. I bet there are communities around the state that really had to struggle and bring a lot of things into line. So my commendations to staff for keeping up all along and for doing a good job of making this as palatable as possible.
Thank you. We need a motion.
I move approval.
It's been first. Can I get a second?
Second, Monday.
It has been moved by Councilmember Clark and Councilmember Monday. City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
And Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes, the motion passes. Mr. Murphy and Mr. King, again, thank you for condensing it down into the matrix that I asked for. Again, I think it helps, like I said, Council, when you bring us these volumes of information, if there's a change in something from what we've done before, whether it's in planning, community development, any of it, it helps to see a side by side of what was it, what is it, what was it, what is it now, and how does it affect us? And again, I thank you, and I know I will have to ask you again. You'll be doing that as we go forward. Again, thank you. City Clerk, would you please call the next item?
Item G2, information on best management practices for accessory dwelling unit ordinances.
Mr. King.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. You may remember the Affordable Housing Coalition came to this committee back in 2020, and one of the main recommendations they brought forward was that the city take another look or reevaluate their provisions for accessory dwelling units. And based on those comments, the committee asked staff to go back and research best practices and bring a report back on accessory dwelling units. And so we have done that. Kirk Erickson is going to share his presentation. And for the committee, I think where we're at, as you think about this, is I think after Kirk presents his information and we go into the debate on this, I think as you think about this, it's really sort of two directions. Do you think the provisions we currently have in the UDO are adequate, which have not produced any ADUs? And if you're not thinking that, then staff just needs some direction to explore a text amendment down the road. So that's kind of the result of the discussion. So without further ado, I'll tee it up for Kirk and let him take this away.
Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee, and members of council. Meredith, next slide, please. So as Aaron mentioned, in the fall of last year, this committee asked staff to research best management practices for accessory dwelling units. You all may remember that we did a text amendment with the council, quite a detailed text amendment process back in 2017. But for those who weren't on council at the time, accessory dwelling units are basically small secondary dwellings built on the same lot as the principal structure. You can see from the image on the right here provided by the American Planning Association, these can either be attached to the back or the side of the existing unit. It can be a basement kind of in-law apartment. It can be a standalone unit. So there's a variety of these things. And they go by a variety of names. Some people call them granny flats or carriage houses or a variety of other names. Next slide. So what are the benefits of accessory dwelling units? Why is the Affordable Housing Coalition and other folks interested in allowing these things in the community? Well, there's a variety of benefits. The first is increasing missing middle housing options. Those are basically those housing options that are in the realm between single-family homes on, quarter-acre lots and multi-story apartment buildings. So ADUs are similar in that nature to duplexes or triplexes or townhome buildings in providing more variety for our citizens. They also allow citizens to age in place, which is basically stay in their neighborhood, but maybe downsize to a different unit. They gently increase density to help support transit, which is one of council's other objectives. They provide affordable housing options, provide additional income for homeowners who maybe rent these things out, and make more efficient use of existing city infrastructure such as water, sewer, and streets. Next slide. In addition to those points that I just mentioned, we're not the only ones who kind of recognize these benefits. As you can see from these cover pages on the slide here, several national organizations such as the National League of Cities, the AARP, and the National Association of Home Builders have all put out reports recently kind of singing the praises of ADUs and how they provide value to communities. Also, the 2018 Winston-Salem Forsythe County Housing Study Needs Assessment that this council spent a lot of time with has recommended ADUs as a way to help the community's housing stock better match household size. Again, household size is kind of on the downswing here. We still have a lot of single family homes, which are great, but we need some smaller products to more accurately provide for our residents who are looking for kind of 1 or 2 person households. As we've mentioned previously, the Legacy Plan also supports ADUs and recommends their usage in both urban and suburban neighborhoods. And as Aaron mentioned, revising local ADU regulations to better encourage their use is the #1 recommendation of the Affordable Housing Coalition that this council put in place. Next slide. So just as a refresher on the history and current practice of ADUs in Winston-Salem, they've been allowed here at least since the 1930s in our zoning ordinance, but recently they were only allowed to be occupied by relatives or caretakers. Attached ADUs were allowed with staff approval, pretty simple process, and detached units were allowed with a Board of Adjustment special use permit process. A court case a few years ago in Wilmington invalidated occupancy requirements for these units, and that's what prompted council to adopt the current text amendment or ordinance that we have in 2017. Just as a reminder, current rules for ADUs basically did away with those occupancy limitations. So anyone can live in an ADU, but the exchange for that is new units now require approval via the special use district rezoning process, whether you're doing an attached unit, a basement unit, or a detached unit. What that means for someone who would like to consider one of these is you went from an $100 fee, which is what Board of Adjustment had, to an $1,000 fee. You have to have a licensed architect or engineer do your site plan, and now you're subject to a public hearing and kind of the uncertain nature that that entails. So as a result, no ADUs have been built in our community in the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So just kind of looking at trends from a national perspective, we've seen ordinances adopted all over the country that have kind of increased flexibility and permissiveness to the ADU process. We've also seen state legislatures in Oregon, New Hampshire, Vermont, and California kind of circumvent this process for communities and basically say to these 4 states, you have to allow ADUs in your communities. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my presentation talking about what are the current best management practices for ADUs. And basically, there's several things that are shared by cities that have fostered a climate for ADUs. And again, these ADUs are compatible with community character, and their ordinances have ensured that through a variety of ways. But the first of those, and probably most significant, is these communities use permitting processes that allow staff to approve ADUs that meet ordinance requirements. So it's not just anything can be used as an accessory unit, gets automatic approval. It's conditions that have already been agreed upon by the council and members of the community, kind of have a fast track. And sometimes there's an alternative compliance process that may use the elected body for things that are outside of these requirements. The second biggest thing that we saw in the literature review and peer communities is if you require additional parking spaces for ADUs, that really puts a stumbling block towards their widespread utilization. The next point is communities that minimize additional setback requirements for ADUs beyond those of other accessory structures have been very successful. Again, from a land use perspective, whether you have a 500 square foot unit that has 2 cars in it or a kitchen and a bedroom in it, that doesn't really have a different impact from a land use perspective. Next slide. Continuing on with elements of best management practices, we found that communities that established height limits, which reinforce the subordinate nature of ADUs while still allowing for flexibility, were very successful. Again, we don't want to have a situation where you have 2 single-family homes on a lot, but you want to provide enough flexibility that you can have a purposeful, appropriate ADU for the neighborhood that it's in. We've also seen communities allow ADUs not just for single-family homes like we do in Winston-Salem, but also for lots with duplexes and townhomes. It's, again, that gentle density concept, that missing middle concept that we've talked about previously. We've also seen communities consider increasing the number of ADUs allowed on a lot as long as neighborhood character is maintained. Next slide, please. A couple more best management practices. We've seen communities minimize those permit fees and impact fees that we talked about, and even in some cases waive them if they're really trying to incentivize ADUs. And the last piece of this puzzle is providing education for property owners on the ADU development process. So again, as you all know from Chris's last presentation, planning and zoning regulations can be complex, and there needs to be a process in place to kind of usher citizens through those, particularly since ADUs are usually built by homeowners and not developers like some of our other types. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. I know how Mayor Pro Tem likes charts that summarize things in a simple fashion here. So this is a chart that I put together that basically shows how Winston-Salem stacks up to our peer cities and ADU regulation of a few key areas. And I'm not going to go through each grid here, but I'm just going to point out some trends. So when you consider the review process, every other mid-size and large community in North Carolina allows ADUs to be approved by the staff level. Again, in Winston-Salem, we require a public hearing at the planning board and the city council, and we require a special use rezoning with a licensed site plan preparer, $1,000 fee, et cetera. So we're a bit out of the mainstream there. In terms of required parking, the majority of communities don't require additional parking for those ADUs, but us in Greensboro do require 1 space per unit. In terms of maximum size, most communities have limitations of one type or another. Generally, the mainstream is 800 to 1,000 square feet units. Winston-Salem does allow a minimum of 576 square feet, which is basically the same as a 2-car garage. And if you have some of those larger suburban lots, a couple acres, things of that nature, you may be able to get a bigger unit because we allow 5% of lot area. So we're actually pretty comparable to peers in this regard. In terms of minimum setbacks, we're actually pretty good in this realm as well. We treat ADUs the same as other accessory structures and allow a 3-foot setback from the rear and side property lines for structures under 17 feet. If you're going to do a taller structure, then we require you to have the same setbacks as a principal structure, which are usually in the neighborhood of 20, 25 feet, things of that nature. So again, a lot of the peer communities here allow 10 or 15 foot setbacks, so we're pretty good in this regard. The last area is allowing for, I'm sorry, yeah, stay on this slide, please, is the maximum height. And you can see Raleigh, Durham, they both allow 25 feet, 26 feet for the height. Greensboro allows the same as principal structure, which is about 40 feet in most cases. That's probably too permissive. Charlotte actually has a similar provision in their ordinance. Winston is actually more restrictive than our peers in the fact that really we only allow 17 feet for our ADUs unless you're doing those larger 20, 25-foot setbacks of a principal structure. So that's a summary in a nutshell of what our ordinance is and how it compares to the peer communities. Meredith, if we could go to the next slide, please. Just in summation, as you can see from this presentation, many of our peers have taken recent steps to promote ADUs, and tweaking their local ordinance standards and tweaking ours is the #1 recommendation of the city's Affordable Housing Coalition. Again, ADUs are a valuable tool in the affordable housing toolbox and can help address Winston-Salem's recently prominent housing affordability and supply challenges. But again, it's been 5 years since any ADUs have been built in our community. So to reiterate what Aaron said, if the committee wishes, staff can work on drafting an ADU text amendment, which brings our ordinance in line with current best management practices. And of course, such an amendment would be subject to the same process we use for all text amendments, where we'd go back to the planning board. This would include public outreach with stakeholders and also hearings before the planning board and city council. So what we're looking for today is just a little direction from council, but thank you all, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kirk. Vice Chair Scipio, I'm being killed by the pollen. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Drink some water. I have a question. If just to clarify this ADU, if I wanted to build a bedroom, a bathroom, and a sitting area onto my house, existing house, is that an ADU and it's attached?
So a lot of that would depend on the access to that unit. So for example, if you have an existing single family home and you might have a hallway with 3 bedrooms off of it, and you put another bedroom at the end of the hallway and a bath and things of that nature, that wouldn't be considered an accessory structure. But if it's the kind of thing where it's attached to your house and it has a separate means of ingress and egress, basically a lockable door, things of that nature, that would be considered an accessory dwelling unit. So inspections staff would basically work with folks to kind of determine whether what they were trying to do met the definition of an ADU or whether it was just kind of part and parcel of a single family home.
Same as if I wanted a she shed in my backyard that has a bathroom and an area for me to do some things, but I could live in it. Is that an ADU? It's detached from the house.
So again, kind of the devil is in the details, as they say. And if it's a she shed with a bathroom, that's clearly not an ADU. But if you were to put in a kitchen, or maybe it's like a kitchenette with like a full-size refrigerator and an oven or things of that nature, that's probably getting towards the lines of a detached ADU, even if you weren't planning on using it as such. Again, it's kind of, I hate to make blanket statements about whether something is or isn't on these gray areas, but basically inspections kind of reviews the plans and makes that determination.
Yeah. Councilmember Clark.
Thank you, ma'am. I do want to go on the record saying is I am in favor of a redo of this. We knew when we approved it, it was going to kill this feature, and it did. And I think that was the purpose for some people to do it. I have gotten 3 calls within the last 2 years concerning accessory dwellings. They all had to do with, one was a father-in-law, one was a mother-in-law, one was a son, that they wanted a small facility for them to live in. My comments on it for the staff, I'd like to have it so that it doesn't, it's just a permitting and it doesn't have to go through rezoning. I think the fee should be reasonable. The fee alone eliminates it. Height, I would want it, and you had a picture about the 3rd slide in of a nice little house. It was a 2-car garage with a little half floor above it. I think that's to me what I would expect at least in my neighborhoods, where someone may have a garage that they want to enclose, and it's no longer a garage, it's a living room, whatever. And the garage may currently have a second floor that's kind of built into the roof. I don't know what square footage that is, but you said 576 feet, I think it was, would constitute a two-car garage. So I would like a minimum in the 500 range and a maximum in the maybe the 1100 range, something like that, I think would work out. Height, I think it needs to be high enough to be able to do a garage with a I call it a half story above it. Oftentimes that is built within the roof line. And I would have no trouble with a requirement that it's no taller than the house that's there. And lastly, I would, and I'm trying to do this without making it too restrictive, but I would have it from an appearance to matching materials. If it's a brick house, it needs to be brick exterior or whatever it may be. But I had a lady call me yesterday who I think is her father and father-in-law that needs a place to live where she can care for him. And you can't even see their backyard. They've got a deep backyard. They were going to actually attach it to the house via a porch. And she was at a loss what to do. I think she's talked to someone at staff, and it was so complicated, she was about ready to give up on it. But I think we can do this, and it would be a great addition to our neighborhoods with minimal impact. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Councilmember McIntosh. Are you ready to, did you want to comment? Where are you at?
Yeah, with the indulgence of Mayor Pro Tem, I'd like to do a little storytelling here. Can I get Meredith to put up that slide that I sent you? So we've been talking about this now since probably 2015, and it tends to get a little theoretical. This is a house that I grew up in, one house off the Atlantic Ocean in New Jersey. Both my parents were school teachers. They could own this size house in this location because my dad was a woodshop teacher, and he built an accessory dwelling unit and garage out back. In the summertime, we rented it to tourists. In the wintertime, we rented it to school teachers. My brother and sister-in-law, who were both retired school teachers, sold their 4-bedroom house with a pool on the mainland and have just within the last year moved into this upper story on the back. My sister, also a retired school teacher, lives in the front house. My grandmother spent the last 10 years of her life in that back upper part of that unit. Meredith, can you go to the next slide, please? This is the first house that Susan and I bought on First Street in 1983. 1983, interest rates were 15%. We lucked out and we got under 14%. This house was $42,000, and I could make that work because it was a duplex. And we rented it for the entire time we owned it to friends who lived upstairs until my family grew to the point where we just opened the door that had been locked, and we used the entire house. When we sold it, the buyer was in somewhat of the same situation. They wanted to be downtown. Prices were rising. They could afford to buy it because they had the income from the duplex unit upstairs. So that's the end of my slideshow there. But, I've been a proponent of this for, ever since we started talking about it. And there are real life examples of why this is a tool for people to get into the wealth building of buying and owning a house that just are increasingly difficult right now. Again, if any of you have been in the market or have family who are in the market, it's a really difficult time to become a first-time home buyer. And this type of a tool, as Kirk mentioned before, this is not something that developers go after. This is something that people do because, for the most part, they're doing this because of personal situations within their family. So it's got my support. I agree with most of what Mr. Clark said. I don't know about the no matching materials, not having matching materials involved, but I think we effectively killed ADUs last time around. This time I want to make it a tool that more people can use. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Mundy?
Thank you. Echoing much of what has just been said, we definitely need to reduce the barriers. I have a citizen who just called me yesterday, and he has a building already in his backyard, and he wants to convert this to an ADU to care for an ailing sister. He needs to be close enough to her that he can literally walk across his backyard, but he does not have room for her in the house except for upstairs, and her health condition will not allow him to do that. If at some point in time his sister is no longer there, it does turn into an opportunity for him to generate income. And it also is generating, particularly I'm thinking about the neighborhood of Ardmore. Several people on the Ardmore Neighborhood Association have expressed to me the interest in having some affordable starter homes in the Ardmore neighborhood. And basically what exists there now is just priced itself out of the market for a starter home. So I agree that this is a good direction to move in. I did have one question about water. These two units could probably be metered separately for electrical purposes, but would they operate under one single water meter, or would they be metered differently? That's a very tactical question. I'm just curious.
I'm going to let Mr. DeCane answer that question. It looks like he's made himself visible.
Yeah, that's the thing about that camera button. It really puts you out there. Good evening, Madam Chair, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee, members of the City Council. So Councilmember Mundy, you ask a very good question. So I'll keep it very brief. And Councilmember McIntosh caught me on a wastewater item before where I bored everybody with technical speak. So in layman's terms, it would be difficult to run a separate water and or sewer service to most locations that would support an accessory dwelling unit, because there's either already a driveway there or there's limited space between the properties. So there's a very strong likelihood that the accessory dwelling unit could use the same service if it's an adequate size, especially on the water side. That already supplies that lot. There is some legislation at the state level that staff is reviewing that has some language concerning this, and we're addressing that through those channels. But the potential exists to have that. Really, the risk is on the sewer side, because anything that the folks in the accessory dwelling unit put down the sewer could have an adverse impact on the primary dwelling unit if they're not responsible users of that service.
Would it increase the charge, the wastewater charge, as far as impervious property? I'm still learning these terms. But if you've got another roof basically on the property, wouldn't that increase somewhat a bill for stormwater runoff that we're paying for?
I personally don't know the answer to that. Aaron, do you have a thought on that?
Damon, I think maybe one way to look at it, Councilor Mundy, is, kind of like Kirk mentioned, we already allow accessory structures. So those are out there by right now. So from an impervious surface standpoint, those are being put in backyards left and right. They're just housing cars and lawnmowers right now. So really, what we're talking about is allowing the same exact or same similar size structure, but now the question is, can people live in it?
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember Larson.
Yes, thank you. Couple points of clarity maybe, and I know that some of this is at the state level now with House Bill 401 and State Senate Bill 349, which basically, as I recall, says that all utilities would be tied into the primary dwelling. And so the question I sort of have is, are these to be separately addressed? Are they going to have a separate post office address? And I'm assuming also that there's no subdivision of the lots, obviously, that whatever is built on these lots will remain whatever the zoning jurisdiction of that particular RS4, RS9, or whatever it is, would remain the same. And these don't constitute a separate zoning category, which means they would never be sold separately from the primary dwelling. Is that valid?
Councilmember Larson, just to answer each of those individually, my understanding of the Forsythe County addressing ordinance is, yes, each of these units would have to be addressed separately, especially for EMS location purposes and things of that nature. From the zoning perspective, you're absolutely right that this wouldn't change the zoning designation of a property. Basically, this would just be an allowed accessory use, like as Aaron mentioned, the two-car garage detached or things of that nature that are already there. And so if the property was sold, the ownership of both the accessory structure and the principal structure would kind of be packaged together.
So the ramification of this separate living unit, I mean, we all agreed that it's wonderful to have an auxiliary room for grandparents or children or infirm family members or what have you. And I mean, that was always in place. What's different now is that basically this unit is available to anybody to theoretically rent, not to own, but to rent that unit at whatever market rate or whatever rates established based on the value of these buildings being imposed on. And I think one of the things that's showing up, which you haven't addressed, is short-term rental versus long-term rental, and whether these units are designed to be Airbnb'd or whether they're designed to be, in fact, long-term rental. No. And maybe some explanation of that. I think there was some comment of that in your text.
Councilmember Larson and other committee members and staff, a lot of the questions and things that we're asking, staff will have to go and research state, general statutes, again, benchmarking what other cities are doing. What I would like to ask you, because I do have 4 more agenda items and 2 of them have been pushed back twice in 2 months. I would ask staff, just like the last bullet point in their presentation, to go forward and create the ADU text amendment language with suggestions. Council members committee, please call them, communicate with them as to what they like to see and help clarify what is the beginning of the language we'd like to see versus the language we put together. And we knew, as Councilmember Clark said, it was going to be DOA, and we knew it. We knew it. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. That is for information. City Clerk, please call the next item, please.
Item G3, information on racial equality.
Ms. Logan, forward.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. Item G3 is an item that was first presented to committee in August of 2020. It's titled Racial Equality, but really addresses the questions around reparations and how the city moves forward. An information item was again presented to committee in March 16th, and at that time, we presented a draft resolution that was directing a study commission at the federal and state level around the issue of reparations, but there was also some questions around the impact of urban renewal on neighborhoods. So there were follow-up questions. Staff took back and did some additional research, and Assistant City Attorney Takesha Red is on the call, and she has an information memo that addresses those questions. So I would ask that she present that to the committee at this time.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. I am Assistant City Attorney Takesha Red, and I am bringing back the updated memorandum that provides a bit more detailed information regarding urban renewal programs in the city. I think specifically some of the questions that were asked the last time was exactly what was urban renewal, which types of programs fell under urban renewal, when or what time period roughly would it be that we were talking about, and who, back then it was the Board of Aldermen, but who were the members of the Board of Aldermen at that time, who were the mayors at that time, and then specifically there was some information requested about Silas Creek Parkway, the construction of Silas Creek Parkway, and how many houses or what the impact was to the number of dwellings in the construction of Silas Creek Parkway, as well as information about the composition of council for the redevelopment of Happy Hill Gardens. So I won't belabor the point because I know Mayor Pro Tem Adams has mentioned she's got some agenda items, so I won't go through the memo at length. But just generally speaking, urban renewal is the blanket term that was given to redevelopment that occurred roughly between the early 50s to the early 1970s. The first urban renewal project that would go under that banner here in the city of Winston-Salem was the construction of Happy Hill Gardens on the Happy Hill area or New Liberia area of the city. That allowed for residents who were previously living in an area of town known as the Pond to relocate to that area. And then the Pond, which is the area that's, I guess it would be at the bottom of Trade and maybe Patterson, going into what used to be Kimberly Park. That area was referred to as the Pond due to a flood that occurred in the early 1900s. But those residents were then relocated to Happy Hill, and then an urban renewal project took place in that area that consisted of drainage, paving, plumbing lines, sewer lines, et cetera, and then it was later developed. So the public housing projects in the city fell under the banner of urban renewal, as well as the construction of, at that point, it was entitled the North-South Highway, North-South Expressway and East-West Expressway. We now know those to be Salem, what is now known as Salem Parkway, and Highway 52. And then there were other various projects that happened also within that time frame. I think one of them was the construction of, it was then Claremont Boulevard, but it's now what we know as Martin Luther King Drive, Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. And I think there was some further east, Kimberly Park over in the northern portion of the city, not Kimberly Park, I'm sorry, Piedmont Park. And some Bon Air, Patterson, that particular area in the northern portion of the city. So that's just kind of some general information. As I said, I won't belabor the point because the memo kind of lays it out and then it provides charts and graphs, et cetera. And I'll also reserve time because I know some council members may have specific questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer those. And I believe Mr. King is still on the call. He and his staff were very, very helpful in digging up some old articles and pictures that kind of speak to what the area looked like in terms of density prior to the redevelopment. And then there are also some figures in the memo that address exactly how many units of housing per project were either, some of them were able to be rehabbed in the later phases, but in the earlier phases, none of that housing was able to be salvaged.
Does anyone have any questions of Attorney Red? Councilmember Clark.
Yeah, I think I'm referring to, you call them projects number 2 and 3. When I drive up 52 now and look to the right, I see they're basically 2-story, fairly plain looking apartments. And matter of fact, at the meeting, was it last week or finance yesterday, we talked about the project. Yesterday. I'm assuming what I'm seeing are the apartments that were built in place of what was torn down.
Yes.
So
there are actually 2.
Second and Third Street.
Yes. So there's that one, and then there's actually the ones that are further. So I guess that would be the south. That's referred to. I think they're Southgate apartments, and then there's I think Garden Ridge may be the name of them, and they're the ones that are kind of right behind Highland and go closer towards MLK, and they're also, I guess, in the process of being redeveloped by the church that's in that area.
And how about Cleveland? The ones I see from this is further up 52 from, I guess that's Cleveland Avenue that I see.
Colony Place, across from the school.
Yeah, were those the same era? They kind of look the same.
Colony Place came after the 70s, after the first Kennedy Junior High, before all the expansion. Colony Place came after the Martin Luther King / Claremont created, when they came through and demolished all the houses. Colony Place was what came afterwards, was that development.
Yeah. Okay. My thought here is, I think to complete the story, we need to say that apartments were built or whatever, because what I see we're coming to is kind of a life cycle on those apartments, and it's time to pretty them up. there must have been a blind architect that designed them because they certainly don't have much curb appeal. But I just think you need a little something to finish the story on those.
Okay.
And you don't need to count the number of units and all that. Just kind of a general description would be fine. Thank you.
Councilmember Larson, then Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, I want to thank you so much. It's one of the most compelling visuals I think we've seen presented about what was actually lost by these federal highway projects, particularly US 52 and Parkway. I mean, I was particularly compelled by the commercial districts that apparently were impacted, not simply just the housing projects as a whole. And I wanted to thank you for pulling together the inventory of city officials that have been involved in this city since 1949 or so. It's a good list. I haven't seen that list before, and I think it's very useful. I do have 3 names I'd like you to add, and that's Frank Fry and Hugh Wright, who were both South Ward council members, or actually aldermen at that point. And then, of course, Martha Wood was mayor at one point, and those names should probably be added to that list. But I think it's an important list. Yeah, important list to add. And thank you for pulling all that together.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, thank you for pulling out all of this information. The only thing that is very important to note is that the pictures that were shown was all of the bad housing. The good housing that existed, they didn't take pictures of that. The houses that African Americans owned on Highland and 14th Street and throughout the area, all of it was demolished without any kinds of discussion of saving any of it. So yes, there was a lot of poor housing, but the good housing, they didn't capture pictures of those because the story of urban renewal had to be one of slums. So it's really important to note that all of what you see is not what all of East Winston was or some of the other areas. And so, Mr. Clark, when you drive up 52, what you see on the right side of East Winston is what came back after urban renewal. Everything along 52 came back, starting down at Winston-Salem State, where all of those buildings are that you see, the dorms. That's part of what came back, all the way up to Liberty Street. Now, when you get to 19th Street, 20th Street, et cetera, that which has been cleared was not part of urban renewal in the 70s. That has happened more recently.
Okay.
So that's why you just need to have that little, but 50 years ago, what you see came back. And of course, it's in a bad shape now. That's why we're having activities to try to revitalize that whole area.
Thank you.
But thank you for an excellent report, those who put it together.
Any more comments or questions on this item? This is information, but I do want everyone to say, eventually we got to get to a point where we have to create something. Just like we do with other text amendments and UDOs and resolutions, we're going to have to create something. And I'm charging Attorney Red, Ms. Logan Ford, Attorney Carmen, and Ms. Martin to handle it. Again, you have to remember our city has never really officially apologized for its role in slavery. We're living in a time right now, as I spoke with some folks that I was in a meeting with this morning, Zoom. If we can't have these discussions now, then we'll never have them. And we need to have them as a city if we're going to move forward and do better by everybody. We got to clear some hearts and some conscience and some mind. So, Attorney Red, Ms. Logan Ford, go ahead. You got something to say?
I do. Mayor Pro Tem Adams,
I thought you were saying hallelujah, but go ahead.
There is a resolution that is attached to this item that staff has drafted. This was based on the initial direction that we received in August. That resolution was attached in March. And there were some additional questions that were asked around the impact of urban renewal, but that didn't necessarily change the language that was listed in the resolution. So if there was additional information that council would like staff to include in the resolution, then please let us know, or the resolution could stand as it is, as it addresses the study commission to look at the issue of reparations for Black and African American citizens, and it clearly details the impact on the African American community in Winston-Salem with urban renewal projects. So that is part of the resolution. So if you would like for staff to make some modifications to that, if you just please let us know, we can do it, or it could stand as it is.
Okay. I am going to ask the city attorney, can I propose a motion to accept the resolution?
Yes, you can.
May I have a motion to accept item G3, please? Councilmember Scipio, see you have your hand up.
Yes, Madam Chair, I move that we accept the resolution.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Mayor Pro Tem, can we have just a moment to find that document? I think I've read it, but I just want to.
It's in G3. It's got RES in front of it. It's a Word document attachment in your packet.
Yes, I did read that, and I second the motion.
Thank you. It has been moved and properly seconded for approval of item G3. City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark.
I'll abstain at this time.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
A definite yes. The motion has been moved and approved. Thank you all that has worked on this. There's more work to do, but we'll move forward with it till Monday night. Thank you. City Clerk, please call the next item.
Item G4, information on funding to agencies assisting persons experiencing homelessness, along with key program performance data for funding years 2018-2019, 2019-2020, and 2020-2021.
Ms. Logan Ford and Ms. Newman.
Again, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. Item G4 provides a summary of funding that the City of Winston-Salem has provided through the continuum of care to support individuals experiencing homelessness in the community. We thought that it was timely to bring this information before committee to share the numbers that we have to date, and also to give you an idea of how many individuals are experiencing homelessness in our community that are identified when we do the annual point in time count. So I'd ask Ms. Newman if she would share this information with the committee.
And unfortunately, Ms. Newman, I got 25 minutes to get through 3 agenda items. So
we'll be brief.
All right.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon again, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee, and other council members. If I could ask Ms. Meredith Martin to pull up the presentation, and we will do a quick walk in time. This first slide goes with the year 2018-2019, and this is collaborative of the amount of monies for the combined programs that we've had that year. As you'll see, 70% of that money was spent on COC related items to the tune of $1.9 million. If you'll go to the next slide, please. That slide breaks down how those funds were divided between agencies, and you will see that 29% of those funds that year went to United Way, 21% went to HAWS, that does our tenant-based rental assistance, and then the next 2 major categories were split between Bethesda Center for the Homeless and Experiment in Self-Reliance. And then there's a capture of a group of agencies that got less than $65,000. They're all captured there in the orange area with the 9%. Next slide, please. So then we move to the year 2019-2020. And in this particular year, the COC received percent of the money, and then, or the source of funds was 20% of the money. CDBG was a substantial portion of the funds that year. And so then we'll go to the next slide. And again, you'll see how we break down where those dollars were spent per agencies. And so again, in that particular year, 28% went to experiment and self-reliance, 26% went to United Way, 17% went to HAWS. Next slide. So 2020, 2021, which brings us into our current year, 75% of the money came from COC funds from the federal government. And then we'll move to the next slide. And to show the agency breakdown of this particular set of funds, 30% was experiment and self-reliance, 28% was United Way, and then our next largest grantee under there was HAWS at 16%. And again, we're working kind of top of the line here. Next slide is our total CARES Act funding. And so you'll see here that 40% of the CARES Act funding went to United Way, 19% of the funding went to the Bethesda Center. And if you'll recall from the earlier presentation, Bethesda Center is who has been running, by and large, the medically fragile shelter. And so those are the two largest ones. And of course, 13% was a conglomeration of agencies. I believe that's the one. No, Financial Pathways. That's the next highest one, which is the agency that's doing the mortgage assistance under RUMA. So that's why you see a significant amount of dollars there, because those were CARES Act dollars. Next slide. And so as Ms. Logan Ford mentioned at the intro, these are the point in time numbers for the last few years. And again, as the heading says, the point in time is a count once out of the year that generally takes place the last week in January, where street outreach teams and volunteers go out and try to identify those who are actually living on the street. These are not individuals in shelter, but individuals living on the street. And so our last year for which we actually have the data for we call it the PIT count is January of last year. And in January of last year, we had 504 people. So our numbers, unfortunately, have gone up a little bit. We don't have the final data in for the 21 count because, again, they had to do a modified count because of COVID. So we don't actually have that final number before us yet. But we don't expect to see a significant improvement in the numbers. Next slide. And so then we try to do some analysis based on demographics, looking at the age of those who are unsheltered as part of the PIT count. And so as you'll see that over the years, most of the individuals have been over the age of 24. We did see a decline last year in those who were between the ages of 18 to 24, and a small increase in those who were under the age of 18, or what you would call the youth homeless.
Mrs. Newman, I hate to interrupt, but would the absolute numbers on this slide correspond to the previous slide?
Not necessarily, because in some instances, what you'll have is family counts. And so sometimes some of it won't always add up completely. Okay. And I can get some more detail.
Well, it just seemed counterintuitive to me that 2018 on this slide is larger than 2020. When it was the reverse on the previous slide. So that raised the question. But.
Right, and so it's that age demographic, right? Okay. So those who are over 24 are higher. But I do actually see your point, and I can get with you to get you some more detail about the total breakdown and how it shakes out. So I'll make a note of that so that we can follow up with you.
Thank you.
So this is just kind of that 50,000 foot level on that particular one around age. The next slide, please. And then we also tried to do an analysis based on the racial breakdown. And as we've seen here, generally over the years, African-American population has been more represented in those who are unsheltered in our community. Next slide. Then we look at those who've been chronically homeless, and that speaks to a period of time that people have been unsheltered on the street. And we've seen that that number has been increasing over time. Next slide, please. And then again, this particular chart shows those who've been residing in emergency shelters, those who've been sheltered in transitional housing, and those who have been totally unsheltered. And that just kind of shows you the number. So the sheltered number, those in emergency shelter, that has gone up a little, which is better than having those in the unsheltered population, of course. But what we also have seen for 2020 is that the unsheltered population went up as well. Next slide. And then this is the gender breakdown. And of course, you'll see here that the overwhelming majority of those who have been unsheltered are males. And that's our presentation. I'll be happy to answer questions. And then with me today is Sharika Floyd, our COC program manager. And anything I can't answer, I'm sure she can.
Are there any, I see Councilmember Clark and then Councilmember
Yes. Thank you. Ms. Newman, of the chart that showed the number of homeless at point in time from the January survey, do you have data prior to, what was it, 2017, I think was the last year, if you could provide more of that? I always remember that number being around 500, but prior to 2020, it was considerably lower than that. Second question, we've had a big push to get the chronically homeless into permanent housing. So if I got someone who's chronically homeless and we have placed them into a apartment, I guess is where most of them are going, are they still homeless or are they not homeless? And I guess that the larger question there is, how do you define someone who is homeless? If someone is living at the Bethesda Center or the Samaritan Ministries, they're kind of homeless and they're kind of not, because they do have a bed assigned to them and a warm meal. So if you could comment on both those.
Sure. Residents in a shelter, you are still homeless. There is a very specific definition that HUD has. And even when someone is placed within what we would call a permanent home, they have to remain in that home for a consecutive period of time before they are actually considered to be out of that homeless category. Ms. Floyd can give some more specificity on that, but we can't put somebody in a unit, in an apartment, and then 6-9 months later, for whatever reason, they lose that apartment and they are back in the shelter. They were still considered homeless because they didn't reach essentially a 2-year benchmark for housing stability, but it's very specifically defined by HUD, and I think it requires a 2-year continuous residence in an apartment or a stable living environment.
Could you, and I don't know how readily available this is, how many of those quote homeless folks are actually in their own place now? And I understand the fact that the point in time, but maybe we could place everyone in apartments so everyone has their own place, but we would still have a large homeless number by that definition.
So you're asking how many people we've placed in housing who've not reached that 2-year benchmark?
Yeah, that are still counted, yeah.
Okay, all right, we can, Ms. Floyd is gonna speak.
I guess I'm saying we're not getting credit for trying here. If we've placed 100 people in apartments and they're doing fine, it had been 2 years, it seemed like to me that ought to be a separate category than counting them as the same person living in a tent city up there on Akron Drive.
And we do report those numbers to HUD. Yes, we report those numbers to HUD.
I understand. No problem. Thank you.
Councilmember Scipio.
Ms. Newman, mine has to deal with your department. How much time does your department put into this homeless issue? You've given us all these reports, but it seems like there's to me, a tremendous amount of staff time dealing with the homeless issue. So can you tell me basically how much time does your department put into it? And do we have dedicated staff to it, or is this something that you do?
So we have currently 3 dedicated staff, 2 of whom we brought in January on a temporary basis. Depending on funding and other information going forward, we'll have to revisit whether those temporary positions are extended. But prior to January, we had 1 full-time dedicated staff. And then I spend probably, I don't know, I'd have to check how much of my time I spend on this issue, as well as some of our other staff that support some of the administrative costs. So we have a number of folks who have their hands in this, but 1 full-time, 100% dedicated staff person prior to January.
And I think that's significant that we are putting that kind of commitment to the homeless in our city. I did not know that, and I think I commend your department for having that much staff addressing this issue, because it possibly could have been worse if we hadn't been taking good care of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Scipio. And before COVID, the city of Winston-Salem, as Councilmember Clark has said, we've always partnered or worked towards alleviating or trying to help homeless population in our city. With COVID, the world changed. Cities received the federal fundings and the state fundings, and there is a requirement that we do certain work. So now we're at a place where even our staff, as Ms. Newman said, we may have to revisit a whole lot of departments and things that we do based on what's going to happen even 6 months or a year down the road, whether we get the rescue money, infrastructure, and other funding sources. Are there any more other questions? Because if not, we're going to go on to the next informational item. Mr. Councilmember McIntosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just real quick. I think to go to Councilmember Scipio's question, it's important to recognize the role of the COC and how their funding comes through, and also the 30+ umbrella groups that operate around the question of homelessness underneath the COC. So that's, besides the resources that we put into it, we're heavily involved and heavily engaged through the COC. And then and if I could get Ms. Newman to just quickly run down a definition between chronically homeless versus temporary homeless, and kind of explain why that's an important concept.
I'll actually ask Ms. Floyd if she'll share that information. Ms. Floyd, will you share that, please?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So just talk a minute or two about the difference between chronically homeless and those who are temporarily homeless.
So the chronically homeless population are individuals or families who have been homeless, and they have good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and City Council. The chronically homeless are individuals who have disabilities and who have been homeless for 12 consecutive months, or they have experienced at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. And those 4 episodes of homelessness can add up to 12 months. So the time between those 4 episodes of homelessness needs to be at least 7 days.
And then temporarily homeless are people who, for one reason or another, are out from under a roof for some short period of time, but are on their way to some other place.
So those who are not chronically homeless, they do not meet the chronically homeless definition. They do not have that long-term homeless status, nor do they might not have that disability. So the 2 requirements for a chronically homeless individual is to have the long-term status as well as a disability. So whether that's mental or physical, having that disability as well. So the homeless definition qualifies someone as someone who is in a place not meant for habitation. So that's staying in an abandoned unit, staying on the streets, someone who is in an emergency shelter, someone who has been released from an institution, and previously, before going into that institution, they were staying in an emergency shelter or a place not meant for habitation, or someone that's fleeing domestic violence.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Burke.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Ms. Newman and Ms. Floyd. This is some very helpful information, and I want to say thank you for all that you are doing for our homeless population. I wanted to inquire about the point in time data and just maybe ask if it's possible to have the data broken down with a little more detail so that we can take a closer look, a little deeper dive, maybe break it down, for example, for season to season or quarter to quarter, so that we can possibly look at trends. And if we can look at trends, that'll help us to have a better understanding of what's happening, since this is one of our priorities, and it will also help us to better prepare. So I'm just wondering if that is something that we can do, because I would like to be able to see what's going on from month to month, season to season, or quarter to quarter with the homeless in our city.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am, we will follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Next, City Clerk, please call the next item.
Item G5, information on Winston-Salem sign ordinance provisions related to anonymization of electronic messages.
Finally made it to the front of the line.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. And yes, we're glad to be here. We certainly see the time on the clock. Just real quick.
Councilmember McIntosh is going to give us 5 minutes off his clock.
That's very generous of him. Thank you, Councilmember McIntosh. Really quick, we had briefed this with you before. There's 2 items at play here with respect to signs. One are the rules around electronic message board signs. The other involves the city's sign amortization, which is currently coming due in July of 2022. Desmond Corley, our land use coordinator, has prepared a brief presentation. Staff just needs some direction on each of those items. And with that, I'll turn it over to Desmond.
Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee, members of council. I will not take up too much of your time. Go ahead, Mayor, to the next slide, if you will. So when we last spoke about this, we were asked some questions. We did a little more digging to try to provide some more clarity, some more information for you all. This is an example of the letters that we sent out during our inventory in 2017. Basically, in a nutshell, it provides some background as to why we're doing the inventory, why we're sending this letter. And then it tells them that by July 1, 2022, your sign needs to be compliant. And then we give them we summarize that with some information about how to get in touch with us so you can find out more information about your sign specifically. And we have a database that allows us to understand what may be wrong with the given sign in any location. Next slide, please. You also asked us some questions about how many signs were non-compliant or how many may have been brought into compliance since we did this inventory. Last time we talked about 733 signs that were deemed non-compliant. That does not include the signs that became compliant between the adoption of the sign ordinance and that inventory in 2017. That's just the number of signs that were non-compliant when we did the inventory in 2017. Since that time, and there may have been more between that first briefing and today, 36 permits were issued for non-compliant freestanding signs, 16 inspected and approved. Those other 20 signs may have been installed, they just never called for inspections. And so we don't have a record of them ever having received a certificate of occupancy. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of all the information I did comparing our electronic message sign regulations with our peer cities, and I've included Asheville and High Point here. In a nutshell, yes, they all allow electronic messages. As far as the change rates for electronic messages, that can vary from a few seconds to a number of hours. Raleigh and Durham are a little strange because they say you cannot change the message on the sign more than a certain number of times per day, which I think is really difficult to enforce. Some of the jurisdictions allow, different change rates depending on what zoning district you're in or what business district you might be in. Ours is just a flat rate of once every 2 hours. As it pertains to brightness, most of our peer communities regulate brightness using nits, which is a manufacturing term for those signs. They basically say, it can't be more than this. and it has to be adaptive to the surrounding environment. So if it's bright outside, the sign gets brighter, I guess. If it's darker, the sign gets dimmer. I don't think I need to share. Oh, some of the other stuff in that last column just says, in most communities, they limit the size of the electronic message to 50% of the overall size of the sign. We don't have anything like that. We've not had any complaints or any kind of questions about that from the community. So I'll move on to the next slide, which summarizes the options for you all. And as Aaron mentioned, we just need a little bit of guidance as we're moving forward with the text amendment, if that's what you choose to direct us to do. So you can modify the amortization provisions to extend the period past July 1st of next year. You can modify the change rate provisions for electronic messages to be longer or shorter than once every 2 hours. You can add provisions that regulate brightness. We don't currently have any of those, or you can mix and match, do some of those or leave some out. All of those, of course, are going to require the standard text amendment process with public hearings and the planning board recommendation and whatnot. So with that, I will answer any questions and wait for your direction.
Any comments? Thank you, Mr. Corley. Any comments or questions? Councilmember Scipio. You're muted.
Yes. Mr. Corley, thank you for this information. I just like a request. Can you send me the list of the 48 signs in the East Ward that are not compliant?
Yes, we can get that information for you.
Thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh and then Councilmember Clark.
Question about the brightness. Are we having complaints regarding brightness and also the change rate? I mean, is there a clamoring either from neighborhoods or from the business community to make significant changes there?
Councilmember McIntosh, I'll answer that. I think one of the things, as Desmond alluded to, our current ordinance does not get into brightness. And I think that is one thing that we have noticed that maybe we're a little bit lacking in. I can think of a couple examples. Councilmember Clark's got one for a church over on South Peacehaven Road, which we heard complaints about brightness. And I think it's also in Councilmember Clark's ward. There's another church over on Peacehaven, just south of Robin Hood, that we did get complaints about brightness there. I know there's a car wash on Peters Creek, which we've also heard complaints about brightness as well. So staff has heard some comments with respect to that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Clark.
3 comments. I think we need to take a look at the brightness, and I would suggest we talk with some sign manufacturers or whatever this measuring thing is and what some other folks are doing. I would think the signs may be sophisticated enough that they can sense whether it's daytime or nighttime or cloudy or whatever. Number 2, if we're going to hit you on one hand, we ought to do something nice on the other. I think we ought to shorten that. 2 hours is forever on a sign. I think you could do it every 10 minutes and you wouldn't notice it. The big one is, do we need to do something on the amortization? This was originally passed in 2007, and we did a 15-year, which is 15 years is 2020. I am concerned that a lot of businesses are just coming out of the COVID recession, and while I'm not suggesting a lengthy protraction of this, I think 18, 24 months would not be unreasonable to get folks kind of back on their feet again. I'm kind of surprised. You would think in years everybody would have changed name or company, but we have a few out there. So I would suggest, 24 months or something, I think would be reasonable. Anyway, thank you.
Great. Councilmember Larson.
Yes, I would agree with Councilmember Clark, and that I think we have to do something about amortization. I just think there's too many small businesses out there right now that don't need to be hit with this particular problem, and I would suggest an additional year be added to the amortization process. I do think it's important in communicating, if we're going to communicate with people about the amortization of adding additional year, we'd be very clear about what their violation is for a particular sign. As a deal with size, height, or whatever. Clearly, we've got a document that deals with that issue, but sending people to the UDO is an intimidating task. And I think we can provide our customers with information specifically about what their violation is so they can get a handle on what the correction might be. I do think also brightness is an issue. I have one in my ward that I've had some complaints about. And I do think there is a mechanism to regulate the brightness based on the ambient light that the sign is sitting in, and we've been in conformance with other places. I do have a question, and maybe this is outside of this particular realm, but do we have any provisions for what I'd call heritage signs? And that would be something like, I'm thinking specifically like in my ward, I have, Mr. Barbecue, which has been around since the 1950s, or maybe the Arby's sign, which is a neon sign. Are these impacted at all by these sign ordinances?
There's already a provision in the existing sign ordinance that allows for those historic signs, if they are deemed historic by the Historic Resource Commission to remain in effect. Mr. Barbecue has already received their approval.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Councilmember Mundy.
I agree with the extra time to get this implemented. I would argue, the guidelines for billboards are treated very differently than these signs, clearly, because I know that the time for billboards is every 8 to 15 seconds. But when I think of the businesses that are using these signs, a lot of them are convenience stores, and the whole purpose of that sign is to generate impulse purchases. So as you're pumping gas over a 5-minute period, you should see at least 5 different messages to generate, the consumer going inside to purchase something. So I think even once an hour is what Mr. Clark said to really benefit the merchants. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be quite frequently. I would say once a minute.
Thank you. Any more comments for staff? I guess then we are talking about edit, amend, get the suggestions of council, and start to prepare it again to see what we got. We all agree that we do not want to tax small businesses or any business right now. I agree with us extending the time out for amortization at least a year or 2 years. I do think that the brightness is a problem all over the city. And I think we need to go ahead and get a handle on it while we can. And it seems like over the past 2 years, it's gotten worse. So we look forward to seeing what you have, Mr. Corley and Mr. King. Is that okay?
That's exactly what we needed. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Next item, please, City Clerk.
Item G6, information regarding the Forsythe County Digital Equity Steering Committee.
Mr. Rao, you made it to the front of the class.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tempore Adams, members of the City Council. I'm going to recognize our Chief Information Officer, Tom Kareska, who's going to provide you all an update on the Forsythe County Digital Equity Committee. Mr. Kareska.
Thank you, Mr. Kareska.
Yes, good evening, Mayor Pro Temp Adams and members of committee and council. And I will try to be as brief as I can, recognizing the time. You've all received 3 attachments to this item. One is an informational memo. Second is a press release that went out last week. And the third is a digital inclusion slideshow. And I'm going to slide through that real quickly and try to be as brief as possible, but not miss the key points. The Forsythe County Digital Equity Steering Committee is 30 plus agencies that have come together. I do want to acknowledge that of that 30 members, there's 8 of us who are we call the planning committee, been doing most of the boots on the ground work. That's composed of representation from Wake Forest University, Winston-Salem State University, the Winston-Salem Foundation, City of Winston-Salem resident, City of Winston-Salem itself, that's me, Winston at Forsythe Futures and Housing Authority. We started out last spring, obviously, to address the challenges we were faced with the long-term challenge of digital divide. And then on top of that, the COVID, as we all know, expedited it. Started out last May, a lady named Layla Garbs and Adam Hill started having conversations. They're both from Winston Foundation and Forsythe Futures, invited a few of us more to chat. And within a couple of months, we were 30 or more interested organizations. As we all know, the world become IT-centric, remote schooling, remote working, healthcare, court cases, city council meetings, et cetera. And while we all hope COVID will get knocked out soon, I think the world will still remain IT-centric in a lot of ways. So the committee, we've collaborated with NC State University's Institute of Emerging Issues and NC Department of IT. They've hosted several webinars that we participated in. We'd like to share, I've had feedback from folks at the state that we here in Forsythe County are one of the leaders in the state of what we're doing. They have a goal of all 100, being the first state in the nation with all counties with a digital inclusion plan, and they provide us many templates and ideas for engaging our community. We also received a $5,000 grant from NCDIT to help towards this project. Next slide, if you don't mind, Meredith. Quickly, our mission, I won't read it to you, but our mission is to tackle what stands in front of having digital awareness and community collaboration, ensure that all our residents have accessible, affordable access to technology, especially those in underserved communities. And our vision that we came up with is just a thriving community where, again, we're all residents are participating and contributing to our society, what I'll call a digital society. If you don't mind, Meredith, next screen. Thank you. We did put together some values as a group, the 8 of us, and we ran this by our steering committee. I should mention we do report back to our steering committee once a month in monthly meetings. But the 8 of us, these are the values we came up with, which are transparency, sustainability, equity, access, inclusion, and integrity. And I think they're pretty obvious why we focus on that. Next slide, Meredith, if you don't mind. Thank you. Again, the digital divide, simply put, is the haves and the have-nots. And we've seen this problem. Winston-Net as a nonprofit has been trying to address this for almost 25 years now. The city is on Winston-Net. I'm actually on the board. But with what's happened this past year, it's become more obvious to everybody. And how do we address the have-nots and the haves? And it's actually not only is it trying to address the divide today, but as you know, IT just keeps growing and advancements and changes to technology. And I hate to say it, but the have-nots just keep buying more and more. So that digital divide is an ongoing target to try to close. Meredith, next slide, please. Thank you. Digital inclusion, I won't read it to you word for word, but it's basically activities to me is a key word, action items. What do we need to do to ensure our community and our citizens who are not properly represented now do have access to information and communication technologies? It does require strategic direction and investments to reduce the historic barriers. And it is truly a path to obtaining digital equity in our community. Meredith, next slide. Thank you. The components, digital inclusion, affordable, robust internet service. We hear broadband all the time. Broadband service that's affordable and that's at the speeds needed to do our work. Internet-enabled devices, not just smartphones, but laptops, PCs, Mac devices, et cetera. Access to learning and literacy training. They have the skills to use these tools. Of course, ongoing technical support. We could give every citizen in Forsythe County a free laptop, but who's going to help them support that going on? And then, to me, the final kicker is the applications and online content to really allow citizens to be self-sufficient and participate in our community. Next slide, please. Thank you. Digital equity, our definition, but it's a condition where truly all individuals have the technology and the skills to fully participate in our society and our democracy. And that's what we're trying to obtain for Forsythe County. Next slide, Meredith. Thank you. I won't spend much time here because, first of all, it's old information, but this is some data that we've obtained. It's a couple of years old about internet adoption in the U.S. and the world. And as I'm sure you all know, the U.S. is not the leader in internet adoption. We do have more relevant information on our website, so I won't spend time going through this, but I let you look at your leisure. My Meredith, next slide. Why is internet adoption important? Why does it matter? As I hit on, the individuals need to have ability to connect to and have the skills to use the internet and what's at their fingertips, for educational, healthcare, employment needs. And studies have shown that those neighborhoods with high levels of broadband access do have less unemployment and higher numbers of business and jobs. And as I was looking at the slide earlier, I couldn't help but think about, jobs and workforce and healthcare and quality of life and economic development. And all that is, why adoption is important. I couldn't help but think how all these things kind of came out of your strategic workshop a few weeks ago as important priority items that council laid out. So I guess I'll put a plug in that IT is important. It's a framework for a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in the broader sense in the city and what council is trying to accomplish. Meredith, if you don't mind, next slide. Some statistics around North Carolina. Won't go through these again, but I will say these are 2 years old, almost 3 years old. 62% of our homes have high-speed internet in our state. 6% of the homes only have smartphones for internet access, and that's not really good for some of the applications we use. And 12% of our homes don't have any computers equipment at all. I saw an update in this last week. The numbers are a little better, but the needle barely moved. Meredith, next slide. Thank you. So what are our next steps? What are we doing as a committee? The 8 of us, as well as a broader steering committee. We have engaged a consultant. We signed a contract a few months ago with a company called AR360, and they're working with us on this project. I do want to note that we did receive a $25,000 grant from both the KP Reynolds Charitable Trust and the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which we appreciate. We are informing the community. A press release went out last week. Our website is now available, www.fcdigitalequity.org. We do have an outreach, community outreach plan that we've put together, and we're starting to kick in. It'll include surveys and scheduling public meetings, interviews, social media, et cetera. We'll continue to gather raw data. When I say we, this is a consultant working with the 8 of us, gathering raw data and mapping it for our community, understanding where the broadband needs are so we can better work with the providers. We will continue to engage our community members. This really is, it needs to be a grassroots project for the community. And our ultimate goal with this project, with this consultant, is to come back with the comprehensive digital inclusion plan, share with our community, and then collaborate how to make it happen. Next slide, if you don't mind, Meredith. This is just, again, this is a slideshow I sent the council back in February, just asking for your help to, spread the word, be advocates for us. We will come back and give you updates, and at some point we might ask for guidance and direction and input. I suspect some of you will be asked to interview. Next slide, Meredith. How can you learn more? These are the 4 individuals who have offered to be available from the planning committee should you want to chat more. Layla Garnes with the foundation, myself, Martha Almo of Wake Forest University, and Adam Hill of Forsythe Futures. And of course, all the names of all the steering committee are available on our website. Meredith, if you don't mind, next slide. And there's the members as of February to the steering committee. We've actually added a couple since then, and I believe we will continue to add a few as this project advances throughout the community. That's as far as the slideshow. Going forward, to summarize, we're working with the 8 of us, small planning committee, working with the consultant, continue the broadband access research and mapping. So we'll be putting it on our website. Some are already out there. We'll execute our community outreach plan, complete our public information meetings, identify local policies and other relevant factors regarding broadband access. It might be where we look to council for some help and guidance. And our goals of the division, develop a digital inclusion plan by the end of May. I can't say it'll be fully adopted because I'm not sure what that means yet. When you got 30+ agencies and you got folks like city council and county commissioners, what does it mean to be adopted? But we hope to have for the community by the end of May a pretty good solid draft of a digital inclusion plan that we'll run by you. You will find on our website 10 agencies, city, counties in the nation that have implemented a digital inclusion plan. I can say there's not many out there. This is kind of new. I'm happy to say that in terms of the bell curve, Forsythe County and this group is on the right side of the curve. I will stop with that. I know I said a lot fast. I've already chatted with some of you in the past about what we're doing. I appreciate your help, and I'll just leave it for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kareska. Again, great work. We always knew there was an issue with digital access, not just in Winston, all over the country, but it came full circle once COVID hit. And people talked about wanting people to learn, their children to learn at home as well as work. Councilmember Clark, then Councilmember McIntosh.
Real quick, because we're almost used up our 5 minutes.
He gave me 5 more, so I'm just.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. McIntosh.
To get someone to where we want them, first we got to have a line running down the street. Then I got to have a line from the telephone pole into my house. Then I got to have a subscription to somebody. And then I got to have a device, a hardware device. And Tom, I think it would be meaningful if we can do this to try to quantify, do we need trunk lines? Do we need lines to homes? Do we need some type of inexpensive service, hardware, et cetera, to try to quantify some of these? This, I think, is a critical thing. I think this has peeled the onion back several layers, and this is where we need to solve the problem. So that to the extent that you can quantify
right
how many households we're talking about, how many miles of cable or whatever it may be, and then we can put a number on it and get to work on it.
I don't know if we'll have a final quantifiable by May, but that is definitely going to be one of our action items, because we want to be able to bring in the Verizons and the Spectrum and say, look, these are the neighborhoods. What's it going to take to get there? You hit on something. I like to say there's 3 barriers to a digital society, digital equity. The first is technology, broadband, devices, internet access. And if you don't have that, you have low digital presence by your citizens. The second barrier is skills, training, education. You don't have that, you might have all the devices in the world, but you're not going to have activity by those citizens. Sure. And the third is what I'll call a cultural barrier, which is if we are not providing content in a way that citizens can use it, whether it's different languages, format, applications, so citizens can work with the city and digital transactions. So we got to tackle the technology barrier, which you hit on, I think, Councilor Clark, and the skills and the culture. And what you hit on is definitely part. That's why we're doing the mapping. We're literally doing surveys with state folks trying to figure out where are these. You might be a line going down the street, but what's it going to take to get it to the house?
Right.
And we needs to be just like electricity and water. It needs to be utility to the individual's house. So point well taken. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh and then Councilmember Scipio.
Couple quick comments. Time is of the essence. Let's not get into an analysis paralysis thing with this. Let's get something built people can use. And then I didn't see any corporate names on the list of people involved. I would think that there are probably some corporate sponsors out there, some partners we could tap into that could help us out.
Yeah, we have talked about that, and that's why I say I suspect our steering committee will grow. Another list of names you don't see on there is Kernersville, Clemens, Louisville, Walkertown, et cetera. It's all part of the community. This is my opinion that once we have this plan to put out in front of you at the end of May, there's going to be some ongoing body to work with this group for years to come. It has to sustain it. And that's where we talked about the corporate, partners, and we certainly have chatted with some. So point well taken, Councilmember McIntosh.
Thank you.
Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, Tom, I love this project. It's sorely needed. My question is the $300,000 that we had set aside for community investment, how does it tie to this initiative at all or not? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, because I've been wearing a couple different hats. I work for the city. I'm on this committee. I'm board chairman of Winston. I'm well aware of the $300,000. I've got a meeting with Mr. Rao and Ms. Tony this week to talk about that. My initial thought on that 3-4 months ago was go back to Councilor Clark says, let's do a pilot for one of these. The school system identified 16 areas that are hotspots. Let's do an RFP and challenge these providers to go down the street and run these lines. And that was my initial thought, the $300,000. I'm going to talk more with Mr. Rao and Ms. Tony about that this week. How does that tie into this? I don't know. And then I hate to say it, but there's 55 million other dollars that are kind of maybe coming our way. I don't have the answers, but I see it from different directions. And this is one reason why I'm so glad I've got to be in front of y'all today to hopefully you'll help me answer those questions.
We got
a lot of opportunity.
We got you, because that's one of the things that our citizens want. And it's needed for employment and everything else. Councilmember McIntosh, it's now, what, 6:20? What do you have?
Yeah, let's go 6:25.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Meeting's adjourned.